Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dualistic Unity movie review series. I am realizing how much I always thought that freedom came from something, from somewhere, from some state, even a state of mind that I could get to, a state of mind that was freedom, and even that isn't quite it. There's nothing you can hold on to that will free you. Anything you cling to is just another weight that hinders you from experiencing that state of freedom. There is no path to freedom. It's simply the letting go of the idea that there ever was a path.
And I am not trying. I'm not trying to be something. I'm not trying to get somewhere. I'm not trying to be nothing. I'm not trying to find the answer. Nothing. As far as I'm concerned, that entire effort is based on an illusion of a measurable value that isn't reality. So I am choosing not to overcommit to that illusion. I will still participate in it because it's fun and there's a bunch of experiences in there, but I'll never take it seriously ever again. I'll never think that I can actually be something other than I am. And so there's nothing to try to be. And on that note, this movie review episode is all about Fight Club, which came out in 1999 and stars Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, and Helena Bonham Carter. This movie's just fucking awesome. I'm almost hesitant to give this movie an introduction because there are so many things included in this movie. There's commentary about society. There are perspectives of mental health. There are perspectives of the meaning of life, of fear of death. There is a whole other level in terms of symbolism when it comes to dealing with ourself and our ego. And I'll just leave it at that. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew, but quickly I'm going to say that I think the thing that caught me the most, and huge spoiler alert, if you haven't watched this movie, go and watch this movie now. Don't let me finish this sentence. Pause it. Go watch the movie. Okay, welcome back. See, in the movie, we know that Edward Norton's character is Tyler Durden. But Edward Norton's character never actually has a name. He is simply the narrator. And so the narrator throughout this movie is caught between two poles in terms of his ego, trying to be something that society is telling him is the right thing to be, versus trying to be nothing and forging his own path. But he's still trying to be something. And that's where the imbalance comes in. And so this movie really is about integration to the point of reconciling both sides. So that way you can find community and connection and possibly even love. And so before I say anything else, I'm going to pass it to Andrew.
Oh man, there is a lot in this movie, but just, going off, I'm glad you set something up for us to work off of here, because I have a shitload of notes and like quotes written down. I was like, all right, these are going to get in here somehow. I don't really know how, but I think that's it, is that, Edward Norton, he has this perception of himself, this idea of himself that he deems to be very certain. And I think because he's so certain of that idea of what he is, that he's forced to create an entirely different character because he couldn't possibly let go of that. So he has to create something else in order to be the thing that he always wanted to be, what he thought was best in his mind. But because he was so limited in his perception of himself that he couldn't be that. So he had to forge this new character that would allow him to be all of the things that he always wanted to be. And that's pretty much what so many people go through. And they mention this in the movie, that everyone has an idea of their ideal person. And very few of us are ever willing to take the leap into trying to be that or working towards being that, because we're so certain about what we are. We're not willing to let go of that. And so he has the perspective still based off of his experiences of what that ideal thing is. And it's basically the complete opposite, because he basically hates himself and his idea of himself. It's the complete opposite of his character. And it's not to say one is necessarily better or worse than the other. It's just, as Ray said, the two extremes. I think I think Tyler is more willing to be the flow of reality and be what he perceives needs to be done based on his perspective of what society should be, but it's still based on his perception. And so he creates the whole character of Tyler Durden in order to almost avoid the responsibility for being that. He was able to foist it onto some other character that he couldn't possibly be. And the reality of both of them is that they aren't it. And there's perspectives from both sides that are actually reasonable, but because he was it hit me that with something like it's basically he in the eyes of Marla is probably experiencing bipolar multi-personality disorder. And what I saw in this was that it was rooted in the certainty, that certainty he had of what he was, that he couldn't possibly be anything else, rather than letting go of the certainty that he had for being his original character. And so if he had been willing to let go of that certainty, he could have been not even been Tyler Durden, but been a combination of the two that was almost more sensitive to reality as opposed to being what he thought was best based on needing to be basically as far from what he was or the idea that he clung to because he still needed that sort of false certainty about it rather than being willing to relax into understanding that he couldn't possibly know what he was.
Now, that's a really good point. The descent into Tyler Durden, right? Because if you think about it, and if you listen to the beginning of the movie, he's telling you exactly what he's going through. The fact that, he can't sleep. Everything feels far away. Everything feels like a copy of a copy of a copy. And that's just because it's just a repetitive perception of everything that's happening over and over and over again. There is no sense of living. There is no sense of existence. There's no meaning. There's no purpose. You're just going to work, going to your job, finish college, do that whole thing. They were talking about their dad and his narrative of, got to go to college, and after that, get a job. And then, well, what then? Well, we'll get married. And there was no meaning or purpose to it. It was just go through the motions. And so he finds himself asking, what kind of dining room set defines me? And he gets to the point where he's so disconnected that it's just hell. It's stress and hell all the time. And when you're in that state where you can't stop thinking about yourself and your life and whether you're enough or not all the time, you start to become numb. So many people have come to me in life coaching situations and have said, like, I have problems feeling anything. And it's always that buzz in their head of all the habitual shit that they pay attention to and give energy to. As soon as you get rid of some of that, all of a sudden it's like you're removing coats. You can feel reality more. So Edward Norton's character is so lost that he can't feel anything. He can't feel anything except the ongoing fatigue and lack of hope. And then all of a sudden he goes to these groups, these survivor groups. And it's so interesting because in that he sees other people who are feeling. And they look at him as though he's worse off than he really is. And so they feel empathy for him, but it's not real. So he's feeling connection, but he's not actually there to connect. Like, he's basking in the attention and the love and all the emotions and all that, but it's not genuine for him. Without them to validate the story of who he is, it becomes meaningless. So it becomes an addiction. And that's why Marla messes up the whole thing when she starts coming to the events, because now he doesn't feel like he can just lose himself in the experience anymore. Now he's back to thinking about himself compared to Marla. Now he's back to thinking about himself and the fact that he's just as guilty of being a fake as she is. And so all of a sudden that buzz is back and he can't think anymore and he can't sleep anymore and he can't live anymore, and that whole thing. And that's what that was. So he's at such a point where he just can't live his life that Tyler Durden comes into existence. And what's interesting is what Tyler is representing is more real than what he has been experiencing, in that it is physical pain. as opposed to psychological pain. And so in Fight Club, he is finding a way back to reality on a deeper level to some degree, despite the obvious consequences.
That is a very good point. I did not think of that, that it's almost like Edward Norton is embodying psychological pain and Tyler Durden is embodying physical pain. So it's not to say that one is necessarily better or worse than the other, but one is closer to reality. And it's still almost a crutch in a way to experience reality. Like it becomes a sort of need and just another addiction, like being lost in his thoughts that drive him to going to all of the self-help groups that allows him to feel that and feel the things that he isn't able to feel when he's so caught in his narrative, in his idea of himself. And that, I think there was a quote in one of the groups when it's like people are kind of dying and it's about close to death, and it says when people think they're dying, they listen instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. And that one hit, because when you don't think you're dying and you think you're just going to go on forever, you're constantly reinforcing the idea of yourself. And through speaking, you're able to reinforce that idea through your perspectives, through your judgments, through your opinions. And listening for the sake of listening is almost like a death, because you're not there so much when you're listening. You're being the person that's speaking. You are speaking as the other person. And so there isn't the perspective of you there so much anymore. And so I found that quote very interesting, and how often we are just so caught up in the next thing that we're going to do and what it's going to mean about you. And I can't possibly listen, because if I listen, I may not know what to say, or I may not know what the best thing to respond with is. And I have to reinforce the idea of myself through responding in a specific way, and not even in a good or a bad way, but in the way that's closest to what I think I am, and that reinforces the idea of myself that I cling to. And so actively listening, or actually paying attention to someone, is through a dropping of yourself. Like if you're actually with someone, you aren't there. The idea of you isn't there as much. And so I found that to be very interesting. And I see now the parallel with the groups is that he was able to drop that idea of himself, because he wasn't, it's like he wasn't even trying to get somewhere. Like it wasn't caught up in the carrot and stick mentality. He was just able to be there and almost like be free in himself in a sense, but he felt like he needed that. And as you said, so when Marla came around, it's like that idea came back, and all of a sudden comparison came back, because he was now there in the idea of himself, and he was comparing how he was responding to people to how Marla was responding to people, how other people were responding to him, to how other people were responding to Marla. And so his idea of himself came back, and therefore everything about that came back as well, as opposed to being able to exist without that so much, because he felt like, he needed those things in order to drop the idea. And then eventually Tyler Durden comes around as another way to avoid that, to drop the idea of himself, to be something else. And so he didn't need those groups as much anymore, because he had the narrative of Tyler.
It's interesting because at one point in the groups, as he is basking in the emotion and the attention that he's getting, and while it is the lessening of his narrative to a large degree, there is this obvious narrative that he has to maintain, which is obviously the fact that he's pretending that he's dying. But it's in allowing himself to feel the same hopelessness as everybody else, that he's able to be where he is, because he's not trying to get anywhere else. And he actually says losing all hope was freedom. And so he's disconnecting from the narrative by pretending he's going to die. And there's value there. But when he is meditating and he goes into his cave and he sees his power animal, and the power animal's like, slide. play, play. Now that there's nowhere to go, now that you've lost all hope and you're here, play with it. But he wasn't able to do that. As soon as Marla came in, he was back in the mess, back in thinking about everything that he was going to do, overthinking everything, literally planning the conversation he was going to have with Marla, like probably for days before it actually happened. She actually said, like, I watched you planning this. Is it going well for you? And it's all because he can't just be who he is, which is why I find it funny that the thing that happens immediately before their first fight is Tyler is trying to tell him, just ask, man. Like, we've had 3 jugs of beer together and you still can't ask? Just ask. And he has so much trouble with it, despite the fact that he knows he called Tyler looking for a place to stay. He just can't be direct because what it means about him, what it might mean about him. And so as soon as he cracks through that seal, the very next scene hit me. All of a sudden, it's like he has the courage to go the next step a little bit closer to reality, despite the fact that he's still locked in psychosis. He's trying to feel something that isn't just the nightmare of what he thinks all the time. So there was a significant turning point right there. And I found that to be incredibly interesting. Not gonna lie, I got a lot more out of this movie this time around.
Yeah, I see that scene very much as symbolic of stepping into the unknown. Like, he's so unwilling to step into the unknown. And so when he, calls up Tyler, needs a place to stay, doesn't ask for it, because asking for it is taking that step. Because he doesn't have faith in himself, you take the step down the stairs, you don't know where you're going to land, but you're going to land. He doesn't know that he's going to land, and he doesn't know where he's going to land. And he thinks that landing where he lands is going to mean something about him. So, when you ask someone a favor and you're so caught up in the idea of yourself, they have a certain response that's going to be okay and a certain response that isn't going to be okay. And so finally he asks him, and Tyler was like, yep, no problem. And then it's like, okay, he landed at that point. And then he's willing to kind of deepen into that and sort of see where it goes and feel a little bit more. It was like there was this massive sort of layer peeled back because he finally was willing to step into that state of uncertainty, that he was able to start doing other things, and then, led to kind of the process of Tyler being more and more active. That's when we see him really start to pick things up, really start to do things, because he's willing to step more and more into that state of uncertainty, be more and more willing to take risks, to the point that he's taking like insane risks with everything going on that eventually leads to, Project Mayhem and whatnot. But he has very little concern for not even what it's going to mean about him, but just what's going to happen. He's able to step into that chaos and even create that chaos. And I see it very much starting with that one string that was able to be pulled through stepping into that state of uncertainty of just fucking asking him if he can have a place to stay. And it's very symbolic of our collective fear of the uncertainty. And because everything must mean something about me, we're not willing to step into that because, God forbid, the idea of ourself gets diminished in some way.
And once he steps into that world, he really gets a taste for it. That's the next step that I really enjoy about this, is as extreme as it might seem, moving into that house, if you can call it that, living the way that they were with the conditions as they were, with no comforts, quite literally living about as rough as you can possibly imagine while still living in a city. They were just getting rid of everything that would have defined them, would have given them something to lean on, would have been something to comfort them. So there was nothing except them and their reality, dealing with their own mood. And so I find it so very interesting that the symbolism to Fight Club, even down to the first 2 rules, really is our battle with mental health. We do not talk about Fight Club. We do not talk about the shit that we're going through. And so we're always in this battle between the 2 poles, what we are and what we're trying to be, right? Going back and forth thinking, no, that doesn't have any value. I've got to become this. And then getting the other side going, oh shit, the other side had value. Fuck, now I got to find some integration in between. right? That is the symbolism. And so we're all going through that. And this is where Fight Club really takes on a beautiful purpose. Again, despite the obvious consequences, everyone in Fight Club starts to recognize that they're all going through the same experience of dealing with the world, of dealing with the temptation of the ego, of dealing with society telling you you need to be something. Everybody comes together under the recognition we're not alone in this experience. And there is an option, a rather extreme option, that will help me feel free and help me get closer to reality and help me get out of this mess in my head. And that's what Fight Club offers. In that way, it's not really that different from dualistic unity, except that we're not going to teach you how to fight one side or the other side of your ego. We're going to talk to you about how to see beyond them so you can reconcile them and they can work for you rather than pulling you back and forth.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that bit up because I definitely saw some parallels to Dualistic Unity without, the extreme violence and all the blood and all that shit, but very much so that, as you said, with mental health, it's like something for so long that we've suppressed and avoided because we think it means something about us. And that was one of the most freeing things I've ever recognized was that everyone's going through shit. Everyone's going through shit. Everyone is dealing with the idea of themselves and thinks that that means something about them. And so when I started to realize, and this was years ago, that everyone is going through shit, I started to feel a little bit more okay with the idea that I was going through shit. Like, I think for a while, people think that they're the only ones going through stuff. Like, they're the only ones who deal with this type of insecurity or that type of insecurity or blah, 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 because no one's fucking talking about it. No one's saying, oh, yeah, I get nervous too. Oh, yeah, I worry about stuff too. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I do that too. That happens to me all the time. And we don't talk about that because we think that we're almost dropping our guard, letting our guard down. We're diminishing the idea of ourself in a way by saying that we deal with these things. And yet we all do. And we're all trying to avoid that. And so in Fight Club, when everyone starts to realize like, oh, this thing's kind of fucked up. Oh, I'm, the quote, I'm making money doing something I hate to buy things I don't need to impress people I don't even like. And everyone's like, oh shit. Oh, we're all doing that. Oh, we don't have to do that. I see that very similarly to the way, I mean, the literal way that we all do that in this society as well, but also with our avoidance of being vulnerable, our avoidance with being open about the things that we go through. And I think that is more of a parallel to everything we're doing with Dualistic Unity, is creating spaces for people to just recognize that. And I think once I started to realize that everyone is going through those things, I became way more comfortable with talking about it myself and just being open about it. And the number of people that I've heard and have come to me and say like, oh, you deal with this stuff too. It's like, motherfucker, I've dealt with this my whole life. I still deal with this. Nothing has changed in terms of not still dealing with it. Like, it still comes up. I've just dealt with it so many fucking times, as opposed to back when I was really struggling with it. I wasn't dealing with it. I wasn't facing it. I was avoiding it at all costs because, I couldn't talk about it because it would mean that my idea of myself was being diminished. I couldn't deal with it because I thought there was something wrong and I just had to avoid it and then, hope that things would get better. And so understanding that the only way to overcome it is through it. The only way to overcome it is dealing with it, is kind of doing something about it. And I think that's what we started to see in Fight Club was, okay, no one's really doing anything about any of this stuff. Let's start doing some stuff. Let's start making some waves, making some ripples. And I think it's very much from, the external perspective of making waves, as opposed to what they didn't recognize was the internal waves. That's more our focus, is that shifting mentality in one collective mind, that shift in my mind. I think that's what they didn't quite see, was the potential of that and the serious impact of that. Because throughout this, and this is, I know, jumping ahead, but in everything that they do, in the culmination of everything, as much of an impact as that's going to make, it's focused on the branches, it's focused on the leaves as opposed to the root mentality shift. And yeah, it'll make an impact, everything that they did, but they missed out on the potential impact they could have made through just letting go. And obviously there were impacts through, the way they did everything, the internal impacts in that collective mind. But I see that very much as the difference between us dualistic unity stuff and Fight Club was very much more of a focus on the external as opposed to that internal.
I agree. There are some really interesting parallels in terms of our approach, or rather what we're trying to do. So in Fight Club, and I know this from my own experiences in martial arts, and anybody who's experienced in martial arts or fighting will understand this as well. There is a level of fear. It's pretty much always there whenever you're about to go into a confrontation. And when you're in a fight, you have to very much face that fear and you have to push through it. And whether you win or you lose, the act of pushing through the fear in itself is kind of a victory, and it settles in and it changes your perspective of what you can do in the rest of your life. And so that's very much what Fight Club was teaching all of these people who were there participating, is that all of their fears were nothing in the face of what was right in front of them, which they could conquer and surpass. And so the symbolism to them was huge. Dualistic unity is saying that you can have that victory every time you recognize why you got carried away in anger, why you got carried away in doubt, why you got carried away in judgment. You can have that victory by facing the opponent that is yourself and seeing beyond the fight. And you can still feel like that and carry that with you into the rest of your life. This is why we do the groups that we do, is to give you a chance to come back and reflect on all of the quote unquote battles you've been practicing in day to day, so we can all celebrate your victories and your insights together, which is very much what Fight Club was about coming together and being one and establishing community and connection through the mentality of being free to a large degree. And again, I understand the movie does take a turn. I'm not saying that that's the direction of dualistic unity, but I am very much saying that it is in the recognition that you are not as weak as you might think, that you start to gain strength and you start to be willing to let go of the things that at one point you thought defined you and made you valuable and gave you certainty. And in that, rather than having your apartment blown up, you can just detach from the things that you have attached to. Tyler actually says, the things we own end up owning us. You don't have to let that happen. You don't have to get rid of all of your stuff and live in a condemned building for that to be the case. You can recognize that what you're really letting go of is the idea of yourself and the fact that it has ever given you any value whatsoever. That's that courage. And at that point, this is another line I like from Tyler, it's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything. You don't physically have to lose everything. You just have to lose your belief that you need those things.
I had that one written down too. And just one more, because I know we're going to keep moving on with this, that I really liked was from Edward Norton. I loved all the furniture that was blown up. It wasn't just stuff, it was me. And that was like, that just solidified how much it was about that idea of himself. Like he saw all the furniture, all the stuff he had as him, whereas Tyler is very much saying all of the opposite. When he's talking to all the guys that come to the house, the basically army that he's building, he says, and covers a bunch of things, but like, you are not the car that you drive, you are not the job that you have, you are not the money in your bank, you are not the clothes that you wear, you are the all singing, all dancing crap of the world. And that is very much through the process of that sort of house coming together. It's like a organism, and they even say that it kind of acts on itself, and it's like reality just acting and doing all the things, because through letting go of all the things that you believe you to be, you're left with what you are, and that's all that you've ever been. And we just, as a society, have attached to all of these things and what they mean about us. And it's very symbolic of just that entire idea of us. And you have to be willing to let that go. And in the movie, they take it to the extreme, and it's not something you have to do. You don't have to go to the extreme of losing everything. It's just about letting go of that attachment to the idea that any of it ever meant anything about you, because it never did. And I think they're able to get that message across very well in this, that they become kind of identityless in a way, and in that state they're free from all of the attachments, and therefore free to be anything. And it's very much pushed in a specific driving way, but they're capable of so much more in that state of freedom that they ever thought possible.
I want to talk a bit about Project Mayhem, because while I understand that Tyler really is embodying a vision that he has for everyone of another level of freedom, like just what he does with the grocery store clerk in terms of taking him out back, putting a gun to his head and saying, I'm going to kill you unless you go back to school and become a veterinarian. That is on its face absurd. But you can see what he's trying to do. The very next day, he's going to feel better about his life than he's ever felt before. Now, do you need to go to that extreme to make somebody have that moment of self-reflection? No, because, and I hesitate to say this, the fact is that a gun to someone's head isn't always going to wake them up. I wish it were that simple. But you being free, you smiling readily, being authentic, not holding on to any resent, not bringing things with you into each and every conversation that you have, you can change a person's entire day. And that one moment can change the balance of their entire week. And that one moment can change the balance of their entire life. And it is really that simple. It's not about these extreme actions in the world to create change, because that is just as much the desire for control. And there's a consequence to it, because as much as Tyler was trying to do good, he was also creating a shit ton of trauma. So you got to consider that as well. But what's interesting about Project Mayhem, before I get into the problems with it, is the level of commitment that went behind it. Because up until Project Mayhem, it really was just about each and every person in Fight Club being free. After that, it became about a collective action from within that freedom. But when it became a collective, it started to lose that freedom. So at first, it was great. Like, I love the scene where they have to sit out on the front step for 3 days with no encouragement whatsoever, to show this really is something that is meaningful to them. You and I often talk about the conviction on this path that is required to truly go beyond just wanting to feel better. It's very much that, except it's not 3 days. It's your whole goddamn life. Nobody's going to be supporting you most of the time, and you have to be okay with that. This actually has to mean something to you. So I thought that that was great. I also really appreciated the sentiment that if you are not ready to sacrifice yourself for something greater, don't get involved. I agreed with that to some degree. But here's where I thought Project Mayhem went off the rails. The first 2 rules changed. Now the first 2 rules were, we don't ask questions.
That's yeah, and that's the shift right there. Is it went from not talking about it to obedience. Basically went from freedom to obedience, because there was that idea of control and that idea for the need for something to happen in order for change to be made, as opposed to recognizing that the change was always happening. The change was actually happening more clearly as reality during Fight Club, when the first 2 rules were just don't talk about Fight Club. And then that switch. And I found that interesting, because when I heard that, there's definitely like the obedience factor, but then there's also the desire to know why something is happening, that I kind of agreed with, as well as we always want that, why is this? We want to figure out the reasons. Like, why am I here? It's like, you're asking the wrong questions. That's not the question to ask, because it's not why are you here? It's when you recognize more clearly what you are, it's like you are here. You are literally, quote unquote, here. You are the here. And so that side of it, but I see obviously the obedience side, and that's where it all began to not to crumble, but it's like that's when I guess that's when Edward Norton kind of came back and Tyler started to subside, was because it was almost like the pendulum swinging. Like obviously Edward Norton's start of the movie is on one extreme side, and throughout the movie it's like the process of swinging and kind of the subtle swings in between the larger swing of the pendulum, and that that was almost the other end of that pendulum, was that desire for certainty of what Edward thought he was for so long went to the desire for control of what is best based on Tyler's perspective. And as that came to be, as the question or the rule shifted to don't ask questions, just obey, just be obedient, it's like the same thing that society was doing that they were trying to topple was being expressed through them. And so I see that as very much the other end of the pendulum. Like Tyler kind of got to the extent of that extreme, and there was a point kind of like in the middle of that pendulum swinging where Fight Club was, it was just what it was, and that was almost when the pendulum was in the middle, and then Project Mayhem was the beginning of that swing to the end, to the point that the initial rule shifted to don't ask questions, and that's when Tyler started showing up a lot less. It was like, all right, we've seen that side. Now let's, swing it back a little bit more. And that's when Edward Norton started to be a lot more involved and a lot more aware of what was happening. He wasn't so lost in just the process.
That's really interesting because there is this transition. Like Tyler Durden is in full swing by the time Project Mayhem comes along. He's fully building his army. But what's interesting is throughout the entire process up until then, the narrator, Edward Norton's character, and Brad Pitt's character are working together. Like they're talking to one another, they're honest with one another, despite being polar opposites. They are both trying to integrate to create some cohesive unit. As Project Mayhem comes along, Tyler Durden is far more in control. He is far more in the driver's seat, to the point where Edward Norton is actually starting to say Tyler's voice coming out of my mouth as he's dealing with Marla or he's dealing with his boss. And so Tyler is starting to take over. And I wonder if that's why, as Tyler's starting to get his way more and more, and Edward Norton's character is starting to fade into the distance a little bit, that he starts to feel more in control. Because it's at that point, it's not just first rule of Project Mayhem is we do not ask questions. Edward Norton couldn't ask questions. Think about that. Tyler was keeping things from himself. Even the people of Project Mayhem wouldn't answer his questions. Think about that. That is a whole other level of self-denial. And there was some contradiction in it. The scene in the car, particularly, where Tyler is telling Edward Norton, just let go. Stop trying to be in control all the time, while Tyler himself is plotting the downfall of the financial sector.
Yeah, it's that two ends and the denial, because it's that, because as much as we it's almost like the process of trying to kill your ego, like that is what's happening in that, is it's just getting stronger because it's the ego trying to kill itself. And so through that denial of that idea of telling Edward Norton to let go while you're still very much clinging, because that's all you know. Like you have the perspective of a right and a wrong way to be, and so you're clinging to the right way to be, and it's like the positive versus the negative idea of yourself, and it's showing the pitfalls of both sides. Like it's a double-edged sword, and there's gonna be pitfalls no matter which side you fall upon, whether you're the negative idea of yourself being Edward Norton's character or the positive idea of yourself being Brad Pitt's character, Tyler Durden. They're both two sides of the same coin, that is that desire for control, and even the desire for control through the letting go isn't quite it. Like even that is in the car scene. They think that letting go is what's best. They think that that act of letting go of the wheel, the literal act of letting go, is what's going to be best for them. And obviously the fucking car tumbles and crashes and it's like a brutal accident, but it's trying to make a point. And I think what Tyler Durden was missing was that there are points that can be made without going to the extreme of it. And it's that process, as we talk about so often, it's not that you have to go to the extreme and live like a monk. You can just let go of your attachment to the things as meaning anything about you. There's nothing wrong with wanting a thing. You know, you want to get a bigger house because you just want a little bit more space to move around. Awesome. If you think it means something about you, though, that's the letting go of it. It's not to say that you don't have to go, pull a ray and live in the forest for 8 months. There are benefits to it. There are things that you will inevitably learn from it, but it isn't necessary. And I think that Tyler got very caught up in thinking that there are things that are necessary to do in order to get something. And there was still that certainty. There was still very much that control in that desire and in that perspective.
And I found it so funny because after that crash, Tyler very appropriately says, and I don't think he realizes how funny it is, because he calls it a near life experience. And had he let go of the need to prove anything, it would have just been a life experience. So swinging around to the end of the movie, because I find the end of this movie to be fantastic, for one, but it also reminds me again a lot of dualistic unity and what it is we are trying to accomplish here. Because while we are not trying to create an army, and we're certainly not trying to go in a certain direction, we're not trying to save anything, we are very much in full swing when it comes to trying to support those who want to be free in themselves. And I love the story here. I love how everybody in Fight Club was in it because it was important to them. I think it's sad that it ended up getting twisted into Project Mayhem simply because Tyler didn't have faith in the people who had helped create Fight Club, who were in fact the reason any of it was working to begin with. All of a sudden it became about Tyler's ambition. And so I find that to be an incredible part of the movie that we are certainly hoping to avoid. We really want to be informed by all of you. We really want this to grow as you grow. And so I learned a lot from that. And what I loved about the end of the movie was that the two sides had to reconcile. The narrator, Edward Norton, had to finally take responsibility for the consequences that were being created by the polar opposite egos that he was oscillating between. Because while Tyler was more free and had less limitations, thinking that he could do anything, he lacked empathy for the people that were still locked in the world that Edward Norton had been suffering through. He almost judged them for not having the courage, not having the strength. And so Edward Norton's character, where he came from the beginning of the movie, was invaluable to balance out the drive that Tyler Durden had. Because Tyler got to the point where he didn't care if they had to kill Marla. The one point of true human connection that he had throughout the entire story. Whereas Edward Norton's character very much loved Marla. And so I like the end of the movie where he does the symbolic gesture of destroying the dichotomy, of getting rid of the reliance on that character, and thus the reliance on himself being the polar opposite to that character. He gets rid of both characters in that one symbolic action. He takes responsibility and he says, "My eyes are open." And what does he find at the end after that hell of being one person or the other person, going back and forth, is over? He finds that in authenticity, he has a woman that he loves and a community of people that support him. And if he can just stop manipulating them, which he will now that he's no longer suffering through the needs of Tyler Durden, perhaps he can create something beautiful. And at the end of the movie, they do kind of wipe the financial slate clean. So it certainly had me wondering where that might go after the fact. I can't help but think to myself, what was the world after that? in that specific universe, because admittedly, it's not that easy to wipe the financial slate clean. That was in 99. It was an oversimplified idea, but it's a beautiful idea.
Absolutely. It definitely makes me wonder what that world would look like. And I think about 10 years later, we came close to finding that out, and we all know how that went down. So I think that was just very telling of, as great as it seems to do that, focused on the branches, focused on the leaves, as opposed to the mentality that would actually create sustainable change. And I think, as I said, with the financial collapse in 2008, it was about 10 years later, we saw what that was, and we saw didn't really change jack shit because there was nothing about the mentality that shifted. And so with towards the end, with the sort of reconciliation of being what he always was, you very much saw that Tyler was still avoiding a lot of things. He wasn't willing to experience that empathy almost. And I see that with people out of a fear for looking back at what you experienced, because you're starting to see it in everyone else. You couldn't possibly face that ever again. So you just kind of suppress it and avoid it. And as opposed to being able, kind of like the yin and the yang, it's avoiding just an entire color because you see that as a certain negative perspective, or you have an opinion of what that is, when you don't understand that there's both sides are very much necessary. They very much inform each other. And so we saw, both sides of it through Edward Norton's character and through Tyler Durden. And towards the end, we saw that they actually needed each other. And the entire time they were trying to avoid the other, avoid that recognition. Edward Norton through the fear of letting go of that certainty of what he always thought he was, and Tyler Durden through the fear of ever being that ever again, when the reality was that he was always it, he was always both and neither. And through understanding that there wasn't anything that he ever had to settle upon, he would have been able to utilize both ends of that spectrum, which I think the movie sort of culminates in, and he's sort of able to draw from both, or at least let go of the certainty that came from believing that he was ever one or the other.
Well said. I think that is about all I have to say on this movie as a whole. I do want to say, dear listener, thank you for being a part of this community. We're never going to call ourselves a fight club, but admittedly, it takes courage to face the things that you're facing. It takes bravery to be willing to question things and to let go of your idea of yourself, to let go of the false certainty that you've been taught to rely on. It especially takes bravery to let go of the urge to blame others for relying on that false certainty. Because as much as that might be true, we are all in this together. And so it's all our responsibility. So we encourage you to talk about your fight club, and we encourage you to ask questions as we build our own version of Project Mayhem, which is less about mayhem and more about encouragement. Thank you so much for joining us here on Dualistic Unity as the community grows, for these episodes, for the movie reviews, for everything that we do, and most especially for being part of our groups. If you are, whether it's in our Patreon groups or our free public groups every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, you are all informing what we are becoming. And we are very grateful for it.
Absolutely. Couldn't be more grateful for what is happening here. So it goes without saying, but we appreciate you very, very much for sticking it out with us, and we will talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.